Today's story, Winter Dreams by F. Scott Fitzgerald, will be worth 5 units upon completion, and will be working specifically with two different learning goals. The first is our inference standard that we work on so very often that kind of talks about understanding nuance like sarcasm and irony, but then also, being able to make an inference based on the evidence in the story. Remember, inferences are that logical leap, which is taking what we do know and being able to say certain things about the characters and about the story and about the plot based on the information that we have. So if you're unable to do that, you'll want to rate yourself at a 1 or a 2. Confidently do that. You want to rate yourself at a 1 or a 2 at the end of the story. But if you feel comfortable with being able to make that logical leap, you can put yourself at a 3, which is right where we want you to be. We want everyone to get to a 3 before the end of the year. So if you're going to put yourself at a 4, that means that you're sort of picking up on some of the nuance. If there's some irony there or some sarcasm there, you're picking up on those things. The other thing that we are going to take a look at here today in today's lesson is how the author decides to structure the text to kind of help prove their point. I talked through this a couple of different times in the story, as far as like when the story starts, when the story ends. It takes place over the course of many, many years, but it sort of skips around, and there's a reason that happens. And the narrator is almost talking directly to you, sort of explaining how the story moves in space and time between New York and St. Paul, and kind of the 7-year difference here and what happened later on. He's 24 in one part of the story, he's 32 in another part. So how that element of the story helps to create mood and explain the point, get the point across in a way in which the author wanted to.
Fitzgerald understood that all of us are striving for that golden moment when everything comes together, when money and love and aspiration and success and all those things that we strive for coalesce or crystallize in just a moment. That's what we think we want, and we believe that once that point is achieved, it will endure, it will go on. But Fitzgerald was too sharp for that. He understood that the moment is evanescent. It doesn't last. It's only for that instant, and then it goes away. The important thing is the striving. The important thing is the dreaming.
The American dream for Fitzgerald is doing better, not just than your parents did, but better than anybody, including yourself, or maybe with the one exception of yourself, could possibly expect. Some of it really is economic, rising above. But it is also a complex vision, because once you achieve that status that you wanted, of course it can never be in life what it was in your dreams.
Do not get the impression that because his winter dreams happened to be concerned at first with musings on the rich, that there was anything merely snobbish in the boy. He wanted not association with glittering things and people. He wanted the glittering things themselves.
This is a short story written during the Roaring '20s, as America was experiencing an economic boom. As you read, ask yourself, what does the story suggest about the American dream and its emphasis on wealth over moral values? Keep in mind that the 1920s were obviously before the 1930s. The 1930s was the Great Depression, Dust Bowl, the stock market crash was 1929. So this was all kind of before that. And to give a little perspective, World War One ended, I believe, in the like the teens, like 1918 or 1919. And people came back to an economy that was booming because soldiers were back. There was just a lot of excitement, a lot of like, we won the war, all of this, right? So that's how you get Roaring '20s. Winter Dreams, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Some of the caddies were poor as sin and lived in one-room houses with neurasthenic cows in the front yard. But Dexter Green's father owned the second-best grocery store in Blackberry. The best one was The Hub, patronized by the wealthy people from Sherry Island, and Dexter caddied only for pocket money. Your first question is this. Based on the information we learn in this first paragraph, what is Dexter's family financial situation? Are they wealthy, middle class, equal to everyone else, or impoverished? In the fall, when the days became crisp and gray and the long Minnesota winter shut down like the white lid of a box, Dexter's skis moved over the snow that hid the fairways of the golf course. At these times, the country gave him a feeling of profound melancholy. It offended him that the links should lie in enforced fallowness, haunted by ragged sparrows for the long season. It was dreary, too, that on the trees where the gay colors fluttered in the summer, there were now only the desolate sandboxes knee-deep in crusted ice. When he crossed the hills and the wind blew cold as misery, as if the sun was out, he tramped his eyes, squinted up against the hard, dimensionless glare. In April, the winter ceased abruptly. The snow ran down into Black Bear Lake, scarcely tarrying the early golfers to brave the season with red and black balls. Without elation, without an interval of moist glory, the cold was gone. Dexter knew that there was something dismal about this northern spring, just as he knew there was something gorgeous about the fall. Fall made him clench his hands and tremble and repeat idiotic sentences to himself and make brisk, abrupt gestures of command to imaginary audiences and armies. October filled him with the hope which November raised to a sort of ecstatic triumph, and in this mood the fleeting, brilliant impressions of the summer at Sherry Island were ready to grist his mill. Notice the highlighted pink, and then my comments over on the right, something that he could make good use of. He became a golf champion and defeated Mr. T.A. Hendrick in a marvelous match played 100 times over the fairways of his imagination. A match each detail of which he changed about untiringly. Sometimes he won with almost laughable ease, sometimes he came up magnificently from behind. Again, stepping from a Pierce Arrow automobile, like Mr. Mortimer Jones, he strolled frigidly into the lounge of the Sherry Island Golf Club, or perhaps surrounded by an admiring crowd. He gave an exhibition of fancy diving from the springboard of the club raft. Among those who watched him in open-mouthed wonder was Mr. Mortimer Jones. So your question says, what does Dexter fantasize about? Surviving the winter cold, escaping his troubles by playing golf, helping the people of his town to earn more resources, being the object of admiration. And one day it came to pass that Mr. Jones, himself, and not his ghost, came up to Dexter with tears in his eyes and said that Dexter was the best caddy in the club. And wouldn't he decide not to quit if Mr. Jones made it worth his while? Because every other caddy in the club lost one ball a hole for him, regularly. No, sir, said Dexter decisively. I don't want to caddy anymore. Then, after a pause, I'm too old. You're not more than 14. Why the devil did you decide just this morning that you wanted to quit? You promised that next week you'd go over to the state tournament with me. Dexter handed his A-class badge, collected what money was due to him from the caddy master, and walked home to Black Bear Village. The best caddy I ever saw, shouted Mr. Mortimer Jones over a drink that afternoon. Never lost a ball. So this is the first time we see Dexter decide that the lot in life that he has as a caddy is not what he wants, and he's striving for more or for better. We see him decide this based on, as it's phrased by Fitzgerald, because of this 11-year-old girl who showed up. I think he probably just realized, like, why do I want to live this life? Why do I want to be a caddy for people who act this way? The irony, of course, here is that she becomes his love interest throughout the entire story, and becomes an important part of his winter dream. Willing, intelligent, quiet, honest, grateful. The little girl who had done this was 11, beautifully ugly, as little girls are apt to be who are destined for after a few years to be inexpressively lovely and bring no end of misery to a great number of men. The spark, however, was perceptible. There was a general ungodliness in the way her lips twisted down at the corners when she smiled, and in the Heaven help us, in the most passionate quality of her eyes. Vitality is born early in such women. It was utterly in evidence now, shining through her thin frame in a sort of glow. So the question is, what quality is emphasized in the description of the little girl? She had come eagerly out onto the course at 9 o'clock with a white linen nurse and 5 small new golf clubs in a white canvas bag which the nurse was carrying. When Dexter first saw her, she was standing by the caddy house, rather ill at ease and trying to conceal the fact that by engaging her nurse in an obviously unnatural conversation, graced by startling and irrelevant grimaces from herself. "Well, it's certainly a nice day, Hilda," Dexter heard her say. She drew down the corners of her mouth, smiled, and glanced furtively around, her eyes in transit falling for an instant on Dexter. The smile again, radiant, blatantly artificial, convincing. "I don't know what we're supposed to do now," said the nurse, looking nowhere in particular. "Oh, that's all right. I'll fix it up." Dexter stood perfectly still, his mouth slightly ajar. He knew that if he moved forward a step, his stare would be in her line of vision. If he moved backward, he would lose his full view of her face. For a moment, he had not realized how young she was. Now he remembered having seen her several times the year before in Bloomers. Suddenly, involuntarily, he laughed. A short, abrupt laugh. Then, startled by himself, he turned and began walking away quickly. Dexter stopped. Beyond question, he was addressed. That not only that, but he was treated to that absurd smile, the preposterous smile, the memory of which at least a dozen men were to carry into middle age. Oh, for a moment, this baffled her. She stood alternately on her right and left foot. "We'd like to get a caddy," said the nurse. "Mr. Mortimer Jones sent us out to play golf, and we don't know how without we get a caddy. So let's take a look at what the green highlight means." So now we know she is the daughter of Mr. Mortimer Jones, whom Dexter caddies for. Here she was stopped by an ominous glance from Miss Jones, followed immediately by a smile. "There aren't any caddies here except me," said Dexter to the nurse, "and I gotta stay in charge until the caddy master gets here." Miss Jones and her retinue now withdrew, and at a proper distance from Dexter became involved in a heated conversation, which was concluded by Miss Jones taking out one of the clubs and hitting the ground with it violently. For further emphasis, she raised it again and was about to bring it down smartly upon the nurse's bosom when the nurse seized the club and twisted it from her. You damn little mean old thing," Miss Jones cried wildly. Another argument ensued. Realizing that the elements of the comedy were implied in the scene, Dexter several times began to laugh, but each time restrained the laugh before it reached audibility. He could not resist a monstrous conviction that the little girl was justified in beating the nurse. The situation was resolved by the fortuitous appearance of the caddy master, who was appealed to immediately by the nurse. "Mr. McKenna said I was to wait here till you came," said Dexter quickly. "Well, he's here now," Miss Jones smiled cheerfully at the caddy master. Then she dropped her bag and set off on a haughty mince toward the first tee. The question is, how would you characterize Miss Jones's behavior? Justify your answer with evidence from the text. Evidence, of course, is a direct quote. "Well," the caddy master turned to Dexter. What are you standing there like a dummy for? Go pick up the young lady's clubs." "I don't think I'll go out today," said Dexter. The enormity of his decision frightened him. He was a favorite caddy, and the $30 a month he earned through the summer were not to be made anywhere else around the lake. But he had received a strong emotional shock, and his perturbation required a violent and immediate outlet. It is not so simple as that either. As so frequently would be the case in the future, Dexter was unconsciously dictated by his winter dreams. Now, of course, the quality and the seasonability of these winter dreams varied, but the stuff of them remained. They persuaded Dexter several years later to pass up a business course at the State University. His father, prospering now, would have paid his way. For the precarious advantage of attending an older and more famous university in the East, where he was bothered by his scanty funds. But do not get the impression because his winter dreams happened to be concerned at first with musings on the rich, that there was anything merely snobbish in a boy. He wanted not association with glittering things and glittering people. He wanted the glittering things themselves. Often he reached out for the best without knowing why he wanted it, and sometimes he ran up against the mysterious denials and prohibitions in which life indulges. It is with one of those denials, and not with his career as a whole, that this story deals. So I think close reading of this section is important, because unless we really understand what Dexter's winter dreams are, I think we'll miss a lot of what happens in this story, given especially that the title is Winter Dreams. So, the text says, often he reached out for the best without even knowing why he wanted it, and sometimes he ran up against the mysterious denials and prohibitions in which life indulges. It is with one of those denials, and not with his career as a whole, that this story deals. So we need to talk specifically about some vocab words in here, and what one of those denials is. The word prohibition means the action of forbidding something, especially in terms of law, but we'll stick with the action of forbidding something. So we're talking about something that he can't have, the mysterious denials of life. So his life is going to prohibit, is going to forbid him from having something. So that's something we need to look at throughout the course of the story, is what is he being forbidden to have? And the winter dreams that are being referenced here as part of a bigger picture are simply that he wanted to have a better life and rising above sort of the lot that he was given in life. So he looked at what he had and he wanted more, and this idea of rising above it. We see that right away in part one, where we see him walk away from his caddy job. A pretty good job, one that, is high society around that country club. He's probably making good money, probably making tip money. These are the kind of people that, can help you get ahead in life if you're networking. But he looked around and said, I want something more. I want to have more than what I have. And we'll see how that kind of manifests itself throughout the course of the story. And then at the end, we'll see if he was able to live out those winter dreams. Question 5 says, what are the winter dreams referenced in the above paragraph? Is it Dexter's hopes that the winter will bring him success? Dexter's actual dreams on wintry nights as he predicts what will happen to him? Dexter's aspirations from his past that are now frozen in time? Dexter's fantasies about the future life he wants to have? He made money. It was rather amazing. After college, he went to the city from which Black Bear Lake draws its wealthy patrons. When he was only 23, and had been there not quite 2 years, there were already people who liked to say, "Now there's a boy." All about him, rich men's sons were peddling bonds precariously, or investing patrimonies precariously, or plodding through 24 volumes of the George Washington commercial course. But Dexter borrowed $1,000 on his college degree and his confident mouth, and bought a partnership in a laundry. It was a small laundry when he went into it, but Dexter made a specialty of learning how the English washed fine woolen golf stockings without shrinking them, and within a year he was catering to the trade that wore knickerbockers. Men were insisting that their Shetland hose and sweaters go into his laundry just as they had insisted on a caddy who could find golf balls. A little later he was doing their wives' lingerie as well, and running 5 branches in different parts of the city. Before he was 27, he owned the largest string of laundries in his section of the country. It was then that he sold out and went to New York. But the part of his story that concerns us goes back to the days when he was making his first big success.
He returned to his parents' home in St. Paul and began working on a book he'd begun drafting in college.
He moved into the 3rd floor spare bedroom of his parents' row house on Summit Avenue. He lived on nothing. He had no money. He borrowed a little here and there to buy cigarettes, and he pinned the chapters of his novel to the curtains of the bedroom, and he rewrote it in great bursts of 16-hour days.
The book was a runaway success, and at 23, Scott was an instant celebrity. At last, he had achieved the kind of fame he always dreamed of.
I want to repeat that sentence so that you can kind of place yourself in the timeline of this story. But the part of his story that concerns us goes back to the days when he was making his first big success. So it's not necessarily about New York, but it's about that first big success. The laundromats in the different parts of the city. When he was 23, Mr. Hart, one of the gray-haired men who liked to say, "Now there's a boy," gave him a guest card to the Sherry Island Golf Club for a weekend. So he signed his name on one day on the register, and that afternoon played golf in a foursome with Mr. Hart, Mr. Sandwood, and Mr. T.A. Hendrick. He did not consider it necessary to remark that he had once carried Mr. Hart's bag over this same links, and that he knew every trap and gully with his eyes shut. But he found himself glancing at the four caddies who trailed them, trying to catch a gleam or gesture that they would remind him of himself. That would lessen the gap which lay between his present and his past. What is the difference between Dexter's past and present? He was once familiar with the golf course and now has completely forgotten it. He was once in love with Mr. Hart's daughter and is now estranged from her. He was once a caddy himself and is now a wealthy man golfing. He was once an enemy of the men he is golfing with now. It was a curious day, slashed abruptly with fleeting familiar impressions. One minute he had the sense of being a trespasser. In the next, he was impressed by the tremendous superiority he felt toward Mr. T.A. Hendrick, who was a bore and not even a good golfer anymore. Then, because of a ball, Mr. Hart lost near the 15th green. An enormous thing happened. While they were searching the stiff grasses of the rough, there was a clear call of "4" from behind them in a hill in the rear. And as they all turned abruptly from their search, a bright new ball sliced abruptly over the hill and caught Mr. T.A. Hendrick in the abdomen. "By God!" cried Mr. T.A. Hendrick. "They ought to put some of these crazy women off the course. It's getting to be outrageous." A head and a voice came up together over the hill. "Do you mind if we go through?" "You hit me in the stomach," declared Mr. Hendrick wildly. "Did I?" The girl approached the group of men. "I'm sorry. I yelled 4. Her glance fell casually on each of the men, then scanned the fairway for her ball. "Did I bounce into the rough?" It was impossible to determine whether this question was ingenuous or malicious. In a moment, however, she left no doubt. As her partner came up over the hill, she called cheerfully, "Here I am. I'd have gone on to the green except that I hit something." The next question says, what does the word "something" highlight about the girl? Her poor vision? Her limited education? Her focused determination? Her callous indifference to others? As she took her stance for a short mashie shot, Dexter looked at her closely. She wore a blue gingham dress, rimmed at throat and shoulders with a white edging that accentuated her tan. The quality of exaggeration, of thinness, which had made her passionate eyes and down-turning mouth absurd at 11, was now gone. She was arrestingly beautiful. The color in her cheeks was centered like the color in a picture. It was not a high color, but a sort of fluctuating and feverish warmth, so shaded that it seemed at any moment it would recede and disappear. This color and the mobility of her mouth gave a continual impression of flux, of intense life, of passionate vitality, balanced only partially by the sad luxury of her eyes. She swung her mashie impatiently and without interest, pitching the ball into a sandpit on the other side of the green. With a quick, insincere smile and a careless "thank you," she went on after it. "That Judy Jones," remarked Mr. Hendrick on the next tee, as they waited some moments for her to play on ahead. "All she needs is to be turned up and spanked for 6 months, then to be married off to an old-fashioned cavalry captain." "My God, she's good-looking," said Mr. Sandwood, who was just over 30. "Good-looking," cried Mr. T.A. Hendrick contemptuously. "She's always looked as if she wanted to be kissed, turning those big cow eyes on every calf in town." It was doubtful if Mr. T.A. Hendrick intended a reference to the maternal instinct. She'd play pretty good golf if she'd try, said Mr. Sandwood. She has no form, said Mr. Hendrick solemnly. She has a nice figure, said Mr. Sandwood. Better thank the Lord she doesn't drive a swifter ball, said Mr. Hart, winking at Dexter. I'm going to pause here to kind of talk about one of the things that's happening in this story and one of the things that's coming across in the writing right now. On Mondays, when we talk about inferences with our Mystery Mondays, a 4 is, in particular, I reference picking up nuance like sarcasm and irony. Well, there's a lot of nuance sort of happening in this conversation right here. This is one of those things that I think we've all sort of been a part of in our conversations where we're all sort of talking about the same thing, but they're different things all at once. This is right after Judy Jones has hit the Mr. T.A. Hendrick, who's in the group ahead of them on the golf course, in the abdomen with her shot from behind, right? And he's having a conversation with the other players in his group. In case you missed it before, this is, of course, a flash forward, and I've backtracked a little bit here, but in case you missed it before, this is the same girl who treated her nurse poorly while Dexter watched while he was a caddy years ago, right? So he was a caddy, then he moved on to start the laundry and got super rich, and now he's been invited back to this club at which he used to caddy to play with other rich guys. And so he's playing, and he sees that very same girl from years and years ago. We know that because of this line right here. The quality of exaggeration of thinness, which made her passionate eyes and downturned mouth absurd at 11, was now gone, and she was arrestingly beautiful. So this is saying who it is without having to say who it is. We know in this case that it is Judy Jones. And so she goes ahead and hits Mr. Hendrick in the abdomen with a golf shot and just moves on carelessly, like doesn't even realize that was a problem, doesn't apologize, just moves on. And he's old and he's mad about it. And Mr. Sandwood says acknowledges that she's good looking as she passes by, and old Mr. Hendrick, who's just irritated with her that he got hit in the abdomen and he doesn't like her because he doesn't like her careless attitude, is mad about the fact that, kind of calls out her more impetuous qualities, her more childish qualities, right? And Mr. Sandwood responds, and this is back to where we just took a pause. She'd play pretty good golf if she'd try. And Mr. Hendrick, he's still stuck on the fact that he's irritated that he just hit her. She's got no form. Mr. Sandwood, she has a nice figure. Not a reference to her golf, right? Obviously referencing her, and he's attracted to her. And then the third player in the group, better thank the Lord she doesn't drive a swifter ball. And then he winks at Dexter. This is obviously a reference to the fact that she really could have hurt Mr. Hendrick if she'd have been able to hit the ball harder. Might have actually injured his stomach even more had she hit him in the stomach with a more swift shot, a harder shot, right? So there's a few different conversations happening there about her at once. Some of it's about her attractiveness. Some of it's about how she's childish. Some of it's about the quality of her play. The point is, she's the center of their attention right now. Later in the afternoon, the sun went down with a riotous swirl of gold and varying blues and scarlets, and left the dry, rustling night of western summer. Dexter watched from the veranda of the golf club, watched the even overlap of the waters in the little wind, silver molasses under the harvest moon. Then the moon held a finger to her lips, and the lake became a clear pool, pale and quiet. Dexter put on his bathing suit and swam out to the farthest raft, where he stretched, dripping on the wet canvas of the springboard. There was a fish jumping and a star shining, and the lights around the lake were gleaming. Over the dark peninsula, a piano was playing songs of last summer and of summers before that, songs from Chin Chin and the Count of Luxembourg and the Chocolate Soldier. And because the sound of the piano over the stretch of water had always seemed beautiful to Dexter, he lay perfectly quiet and listened. The tune the piano was playing at that moment had been gay, and 5 years before, when Dexter was a sophomore at college, they had been played at a prom once when he could not afford the luxury of proms, and he had stood outside of the gymnasium and listened. The sound of the tune precipitated in him a sort of ecstasy, and it was with that ecstasy he viewed what happened to him now. It was a mood of intense appreciation, a sense that, for once, he was magnificently attuned to life, and that everything about him was radiating a brightness and a glamour he might never know again. A low, pale oblong detached itself suddenly from the darkness of the island, spitting forth the reverberate sounds of a racing motorboat. 2 white streamers of cleft water rolled themselves up from behind it, and almost immediately the boat was beside him, drowning out the hot tinkle of the piano and the drone of its spray. Dexter raised himself on his arms, was aware of a figure standing at the wheel, of 2 dark eyes regarding him over the lengthening pace of water. And then the boat had gone by, and was sweeping in an immense and purposeless circle of spray round and round the middle of the lake, with equal eccentricity. One of the circles flattened out and headed back toward the raft. "Who's that?" she called, shutting off the motor. She was so near now that Dexter could see her bathing suit, which consisted, apparently, of pink rompers. The nose of the boat bumped the raft, and as the latter tilted rakishly, he was precipitated toward her. With different degrees of interest, they recognized each other. "Aren't you one of those men we played through this afternoon?" she demanded. He was. "Well, do you know how to drive a motorboat? Because if you do, I'd wish you'd drive this one so I can ride on the surfboard behind. My name is Judy Jones." She favored him with an absurd smirk. Rather, what tried to be a smirk, for, twist her mouth as she might, it was not grotesque, it was merely beautiful. "And I live in a house over there on the island, and in that house there is a man waiting for me. When he drove up at the door, I drove out of the dock because he says I'm his ideal." There was a fish jumping and a star shining, and the lights around the lake were gleaming. Dexter sat beside Judy Jones, and she explained how the boat was driven. Then she was in the water, swimming to the floating surfboard with a sinuous crawl. Watching her was without effort to the eye, without a branch waving or a seagull flying. Her arms, burnt to butternut, moved sinuously among the dull platinum ripples, elbow appearing first, casting the forearm back with a cadence of falling apart, and then reached out and down, stabbing a path ahead. So the author goes a long way here. I'm backtracking a little bit, one paragraph. The author goes a long way here to set up Judy Jones' character. We know from the experience, the exchange on the golf course earlier this afternoon, that she's very, well, callous indifference would be the question that was asked before. She's very carefree, doesn't understand. She sort of misses sort of that social awareness of, oops, I shouldn't have done that, or she's very impulsive. She seems to be all about herself. So she pulls up to Dexter, who in the evening here is now on this raft, and the line is, "When he drove up at the door, I drove out of the dock because he says I'm his ideal."
As he waited to be sent overseas, Scott attended a dance at a local country club, where he saw a young girl who, as he said, made everything inside him melt. He was looking at 17-year-old Zelda Sayer, the daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court judge, who often had that effect on men.
I don't think pictures of Zelda do her justice. I think she had an aura about her. I mean, that there was something about the way she dressed, something about the way she presented herself. The people who knew her all say that she was just a beautiful woman.
Zelda was wild. When she was 10, she telephoned the fire department to say a child was stranded on the Sayers' roof. Then she climbed up there and waited to be saved. At 17, she was already smoking, drinking, and driving men to distraction.
When Zelda was a young girl, she loved diving off high platforms into the water. She used to delight in outraging the expectations of their elders. Chaperones at dances, she'd go by them and flip her back skirts at them. And she was that kind of girl.
So what we have here is she's sort of been made out to be this very shallow type of person, and these are the things you're supposed to catch as you read between the lines. These are the logical leaps, these inferences that we make about her character. he essentially has told her, this boyfriend, this man who she lives with, has said that she is his ideal. He loves her. She's perfect for him. She's very non-committal. She is just doesn't feel the same way. So now it's sort of this awkward. When he drove up to the door, I left the dock. I can't be around him. And she's always looking for the next thing, right? So there was a fish jumping and the star was shining, and the lights around the lake were gleaming. Dexter sat beside Judy Jones as she explained how her boat was driven. Then she was in the water, swimming to the floating surfboard with a sinuous crawl. Watching her was without effort to the eye, watching a branch waving or a seagull flying. Her arms, burned to butternut, moved sinuously among the dull platinum ripples, elbow appearing first, casting the forearm back with a cadence of falling water, then reaching out and down, stabbing a path ahead. They moved out into the lake, turning. Dexter saw that she was kneeling on the low rear of the now up-tilted surfboard. "Go faster," she called, "fast as it'll go." Obediently, he jammed the lever forward, and the white spray mounted at the bow. When he looked around again, the girl was standing up on the rushing board, her arms spread wide, her eyes lifted toward the moon. "It's awful cold," she shouted. "What's your name?" He told her. "Well, why don't you come to dinner tomorrow night?" His heart turned over like a flywheel of the boat, and for the second time, her casual whim gave him a new direction in life. I want to reread that line. For the second time, her casual whim gave him a new direction in his life. What does that mean? Continuing on here. The next evening, while he waited for her to come downstairs, Dexter peopled the soft, deep summer room and the sun porch that opened from it with the men who had already loved Judy Jones. He knew the sort of men they were. The men who, when he first went to college, had entered from the great prep schools with graceful clothes and their deep tan of healthy summers. He had seen that, in one sense, he was better than these men. He was newer and stronger. Yet, in acknowledging to himself that he wished his children to be like them, he was admitting that he was but the rough, strong stuff from which they eternally sprang. So what's happening here is Judy is very much he's just in love with her. She has an aura about her. She has a charisma. But we all know that she's super non-committal, and he shouldn't chase after her, because again, he's just another one in her long list of men who she chases after and is always looking for the next thing. That's what this line means. Just the next one in a long line of men she's chasing. When the time had come for him to wear good clothes, he had known who were the best tailors in America, and the best tailors in America had made him the suit he wore this evening. He had acquired that particular reserve particular to his university, that set it off from other universities. He recognized the value of of such a mannerism that he had adopted it, and he knew that had to be careless in dress and manner require more confidence than to be careful. But carelessness was for his children. His mother's name had been Crimsledge. She was a bohemian of the peasant class, and she had talked over broken English to the end of her days. Her son must keep to the set patterns. At a little after 7, Judy Jones came downstairs. She wore a blue silk afternoon dress, and he was disappointed at first that she had not put on something more elaborate. This feeling was accentuated when, after a brief greeting, she went to the door of a butler's pantry and, pushing it open, called, "You can serve dinner, Martha." He had rather expected that a butler would announce dinner, and that there would be cocktail. Then he put these thoughts behind him as they went and sat down, side by side, on a lounge, and looked at each other. So, she is now not meeting his expectations. She's already not everything that he hopes that she would be. "Father and Mother won't be here," she said thoughtfully. He remembered the last time he had seen her father, and he was glad the parents were not to be here tonight. They might wonder who he was. He had been born in Keble, a Minnesota village 50 miles farther north, and he always gave Keble as his home instead of Black Bear Village. Country towns were well enough to come from if they weren't inconveniently in sight and used as footstools by fashionable lakes. They talked of his university, which he had visited frequently during the last 2 years, and of the nearby city which supplied Sherry Island with its patrons, and whither Dexter would return next day to his prospering laundries. During dinner, she slipped into a moody depression which gave Dexter a feeling of uneasiness. Whatever petulance she uttered in her throaty voice worried him. Whatever she smiled at him, at Chicken Liver, at nothing, it disturbed him that her smile could have no root in mirth, or even in amusement. When the scarlet corners of her lips curved down, it was less a smile than an invitation to a kiss. Then, after dinner, she led him out to the dark sun porch and deliberately changed the atmosphere. "Do you mind if I weep a little?" she said. "I'm afraid I'm boring you," he responded quickly. "You're not, I like you. But I've just had a terrible afternoon. There was a man I cared about, and this afternoon he told me out of the clear blue sky that he was as poor as a church mouse. He'd never even hinted at it before. Does this sound horribly mundane?"
Scott had found his golden girl, the one all the other men wanted. I fell in love, he said, with her courage, her sincerity, and her flaming self-respect. Zelda, in turn, enjoyed the attentions of this dashing young lieutenant in the uniform he bought at Brooks Brothers. November 11, 1918. Fitzgerald's regiment was about to leave for France when the armistice was declared, ending the war. Once again, Scott had missed his chance at glory. He would always consider his lack of combat experience one of the greatest regrets of his life. The moment Scott was discharged from the Army, he proposed to Zelda and was thrilled when she accepted. But before they could make it official, Scott needed to get a job. So he moved to New York City, where he used his writing talent to get a job at an advertising agency writing copy for $35 a week. Fitzgerald hated the work. Nevertheless, he sent Zelda an exuberant telegram. "Darling heart, ambition, enthusiasm, and confidence. I declare everything glorious. I am in the land of ambition and success, and my only hope is that you will be with me soon." But Zelda was already having second thoughts. $35 a week could hardly support the kind of lifestyle she wanted, so in June 1919, she broke off the engagement.
"Perhaps he was afraid to tell you." "Suppose he was," she answered. "He didn't start right. You see, if I'd thought of him as poor, well, I've been mad about loads of poor men, and fully intended to marry them all. But in this case, I hadn't thought of him that way, and my interest in him wasn't strong enough to survive the shock. As if a girl calmly informed her fiancé that she was a widow. He might not object to widows, but—" "Let's start right," she interrupted herself suddenly. "Who are you, anyhow?" For a moment Dexter hesitated. Then, "I'm nobody," he announced. "My career is largely a matter of futures." "Are you poor?" "No," he said frankly. "I'm probably making more money than any man my age in the Northwest." "I know that's an obnoxious remark, but you advised me to start right." There was a pause. Then she smiled, and the corners of her mouth drooped, and an almost imperceptible sway brought her closer to him, looking up into his eyes. A lump rose into Dexter's throat, and he waited breathlessly for the experiment, facing the unpredictable compound that would form mysteriously from the elements of their lips. Then he saw it. She communicated her excitement to him, lavishly, deeply, with kisses that were not a promise but a fulfillment. They aroused him in not hunger demanding renewal of surfeit that would demand more surfeit. Kisses that were like charity, creating want by holding back nothing at all. It did not take him many hours to decide that he wanted Judy Jones ever since he was a proud, desirable little boy. So there's something happening here. Her whole attitude changes when she finds out that he's rich. And when she's giving him that attention, we see him think he wanted Judy Jones ever since he was a proud, desirable little boy. So what is it about Judy Jones, other than her appearance, that attracts Dexter? It began like that, and continued with varying shades of of intensity, and such a note right up to the denouncement. Dexter surrendered a part of himself to the most direct and unprincipled personality with which he had ever come in contact. Whatever Judy wanted, she went after with the full pressure of her charm. There was no divergence of method, no jockeying for position or premeditation of effects. There was a very little mental side to any of her affairs. She simply made men conscious to the highest degree of her physical loveliness. Dexter had no desire to change her. Her deficiencies were knit up with a passionate energy that transcended and justified them. When, as Judy's head lay against his shoulder that first night, she whispered, "I don't know what's the matter with me. Last night I thought I was in love with a man, and tonight I think I'm in love with you." It seemed to him a beautiful and romantic thing to say. It was the exquisite excitability that for the moment he controlled and owned. But a week later he was compelled to view this same quality in different light. She took him in her roadster to a picnic supper, and after supper she disappeared, likewise in her roadster with another man. Dexter became enormously upset and was scarcely able to be decently civil to the other people present. When she assured him that she had not kissed the other man, he knew she was lying. Yet he was glad she had taken the trouble to lie to him. He was, as he found before the summer ended, one of a varying dozen who circulated about her. Each of them had at one time been favored above all others. About half of them still basked in the soft, the occasional sentimental revivals. Whenever one showed signs of dropping out through long neglect, she granted him a brief, honeyed hour, which encouraged him to tag along for a year or so longer. Judy made these forays upon the helplessness and defeated without malice, indeed half unconscious that there was anything mischievous about what she did. When a new man came to town, everyone dropped out. Dates were automatically canceled. The helpless part of trying to do anything about it was that she did it all herself. She was not a girl who could be won in the kinetic sense. She was proof against cleverness. She was proof against charm. If any of these assailed to her too strongly, she would immediately resolve the affair to a physical basis, and under the magic of her physical splendor, the strong as well as the brilliant played the game and not their own. She was entertained only by the gratification of her desires and by the direct exercise of her own charm. I'm going to repeat that line again because it says a ton about who she is and how she kind of conducts her life. She was entertained only by the gratification of her desires and by the direct exercise of her own charm. Perhaps from so much youthful love, so many youthful lovers, she had come in defense to nourish herself wholly from within. Succeeding Dexter's first exhilaration came relentlessness and dissatisfaction. The helpless ecstasy of losing himself in her was opiate rather than tonic. It was fortunate for his work during the winter that those moments of ecstasy came infrequently. Early in their acquaintance, it had seemed for a while that there was a deep and spontaneous mutual attraction that first August. For example, 3 days of long evenings on her dusky veranda, of strange wan kisses through the late afternoon, in shadowy alcoves or behind the protecting trellises of the garden arbors, of mornings when she was fresh as a dream and almost shy at meeting him in the clarity of the rising day. There was all the ecstasy of engagement about him, sharpened by his realization that there was no engagement. It was during those 3 days that, for the first time, he had asked her to marry him. She said, "Maybe someday." She said, "Kiss me." She said, "I'd like to marry you." She said, "I love you." She said, nothing. The 3 days were interrupted by the arrival of a New York man who visited her house for half September. To Dexter's agony, rumor engaged them. The man who was the son of the president of a great trust company, but at the end of the month it was reported that Judy was yawning. At a dance one night she sat all evening in a motorboat with a local beau, while the New Yorkers searched the club for her frantically. She told the local beau that she was bored with her visitor, and 2 days later he left. She was seen with him at the station, and it was reported that he looked very mournful indeed. On this note, the summer ended. Dexter was 24, and he found himself increasingly in a position to do as he wished. He joined 2 clubs in the city and lived at one of them. Though he was by no means an integral part of the stag lines at these clubs, he managed to be on hand at dances where Judy Jones was likely to appear. He could have gone out socially as much as he liked. He was an eligible young man, now, and popular with the downtown fathers. He confessed his devotion to Judy Jones had rather solidified his passion, but he had no social aspirations and rather despised the dancing men who were always on tap for the Thursday or Saturday parties and who filled in at dinners with the younger married set. Already he was playing with the idea of going east to New York. He wanted to take Judy Jones with him. No disillusion as to the world in which she had grown up could cure his illusion as to her desirability. I'm going to read that line again. He wanted to take Judy Jones with him. No disillusion as to the world in which she had grown up could cure his illusion as to her desirability. So what does this last sentence imply about Dexter? That he is a realist and focused on the present? That he is immune to Judy's advances? That he is enamored with Judy's social circle? That he is swept up in his desire for Judy? Remember that, for only in the light of it can what he did for her be understood. 18 months after he first met Judy Jones, he became engaged to another girl. Her name was Irene Shearer, and her father was one of the men who had always believed in Dexter. Irene was light-haired and sweet and honorable, and a little stout, and she had 2 suitors whom she pleasantly relinquished when Dexter formally asked her to marry him. Summer, fall, winter, spring, another summer, another fall. So much he had given of his active life to the incorrigible lips of Judy Jones. She had treated him with interest, with encouragement, with malice, with indifference, with contempt. She had inflicted on him the innumerable little slights and indignities possible in such a case, as if in revenge for having ever cared for him at all. She had beckoned him and yawned at him and beckoned him again, and he had responded often with bitterness and narrowed eyes. She had bought him ecstatic happiness and intolerable agony of spirit. She had caused him untold inconvenience and not a little trouble. She had insulted him, she had ridden over him, she had played his interest in her against his interest in his work for fun. She had done everything to him except criticize him. This she had not done. It seemed to him only because it might have sullied the utter indifference she manifested and sincerely felt toward him. When autumn had come and gone again, it occurred to him that he could not have Judy Jones. He had to beat this into his mind, but he convinced himself at last. He lay awake at night for a while and argued over it. He told himself the trouble and the pain she had caused him. He enumerated her glaring deficiencies as a wife. Then he said to himself that he loved her, and after a while he fell asleep. For a week, lest he imagined her husky voice over the telephone or her eyes opposite him at lunch, he worked hard and late, and at night he went to his office and plotted out his years. At the end of a week he went to a dance and cut in on her once. For almost the first time since they had met, he did not ask her to sit out with him or tell her that she was lovely. It hurt him that she did not miss these things. That was all. He was not jealous when he saw that there was a new man tonight. He had been hardened against jealousy long before. He stayed late at the dance. He sat for an hour with Irene Shearer and talked about books and about music. He knew very little about either. But he was beginning to be master of his own time now, and he had a rather priggish notion that he, the young and already fabulously successful Dexter Green, should know more about such things. That was in October, when he was 25. In January, Dexter and Irene became engaged. It was to be announced in June, and they were to be married 3 months later. The Minnesota winter prolonged itself interminably, and was almost May when the winds came soft and the snow ran down into Black Bear Lake at last. For the first time in over a year, Dexter was enjoying a certain tranquility of spirit. Judy Jones had been in Florida, and afterward in Hot Springs, and somewhere she had been engaged, and somewhere she had broken her off. At first, when Dexter had definitely given up on her, it had made him sad that people still linked them together and asked for news of her. But when he began to be placed at dinner next to Irene Shearer, people didn't ask him about her anymore. They told him about her. He ceased to be an authority on her. May at last. Dexter walked the streets at nights when the darkness was damp as rain. Wandering that so soon, with so little done, so much ecstasy had gone from him. May 1 year back had been marked by Judy's poignant, unforgivable, yet forgiven turbulence. It had been one of those rare times when he fancied she had grown to care for him. That old penny's worth of happiness he had spent for the bushel of content. So this is a line that we just cannot pass over. We have to stop and we have to analyze this line because it is one of the more important ones in the whole story. A penny's worth of happiness for this bushel of content. I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to start here. I'm going to ask you this. What do you think that means? Now, I'm going to show you this image and ask you again. What do you think this means? Would your answer change? How might you change your answer? All right, I think maybe the best way, if you're still unsure, to describe what this phrase means is to give an example. I'm going to try to put you in a scenario. So let's say it is May. The weather's starting to get really nice out. Summer's ahead. You got months of warm weather. Your car breaks down. You are in the used car dealer lot, and you're going to buy like a Chevy Equinox or a Ford Escape, one of these vehicles that's sort of an SUV. It's called four-wheel drive. You can fit some stuff in it. It's a pretty newer, reliable vehicle. It's going to cost you $10,000. You're about to sign off on it, and you look across the parking lot, and there is a motorcycle. And you're like, oh, how awesome would that motorcycle be? You don't have your motorcycle license, but you'd be willing to do it in order to buy this motorcycle. And the motorcycle itself, $7,000. So you're saving some money. Okay, so you go through, you get your license, your motorcycle license. This means you got to take a test, you got to pay a little bit extra, but it's worth it because you're so excited to ride this motorcycle. And it's an enduro. This means that it's street legal, but you can also ride it like on trails and at tracks and stuff. So you decide to do that eventually. You're riding it around summer, it's great. And eventually you decide to take it to a track. Well, it breaks. You got to fix it because you hit a bank or went off a jump and you broke something. So you got to fix that. Okay, so you got a little more money into this now. In fact, you're right around $11,000 to $12,000, so a little more than you would have paid for the Ford Escape. But it's totally worth it because you got all of the excitement and everything that goes into riding this motorcycle. Fall comes, it's getting a little cold, but you can do it, and then bam, it's December, it's winter, you're stuck. You can't ride it, it's too cold, and you got to get to work. So you have to sell it, you got to go back, you got to buy that Ford Escape, that Chevy Equinox, that would have been great for all summer, would have been great now in the winter, but it was all about that happiness and that impulse decision that you made right away that put you in this position. Not only that, you have more money now into this mistake than you would have into the car that would have been consistent for you, that would have handled all of your needs the whole time in any season. That Ford Escape, that Chevy Equinox, that is your bushel of content. That's the one where you feel most at home. That's the one that you can trust. That's the one that's easy to get along with. That's the one who likes you. I'm describing Irene Shear here. That motorcycle, you bought on impulse. It's exciting, but it's expensive, and it doesn't live up to your expectations. It breaks. But you keep going back to it because the exhilaration of riding it is so exciting. That's Judy Jones. And I think that's kind of, it's the tale as old as time. You can see from the meme that I just showed you. Memes didn't exist in the 1920s when this was written, but that idea always exists. We're always looking for that thing that's always more, that's out here, that's better, instead of taking what it is that is our bushel of content. He knew that Irene would be no more than a curtain spread behind him, a hand moving along gleaming teacups, a voice calling to children. Fire and loveliness were gone, the magic of nights and the wonder of the varying hours and seasons. Slender lips turning down, dropping to his lips and bearing him up into a heaven of eyes. The thing was deep in him. He was too strong and alive for it to die lightly. In the middle of May, when the weather balanced for a few days, and on the thin bridge that led to a deep summer, he turned into one night at Irene's house. Their engagement was to be announced in a week. Now, no one could be surprised at it. And tonight they would sit together in the lounge at the University Club and look on for an hour at the dancers. It gave him a sense of solidity to go with her. She was so sturdily popular, so intensely great. He mounted the steps of the brownstone house and stepped inside. "Irene," he called. Mrs. Shearer came out of the living room to meet him. "Dexter," she said, "Irene's gone upstairs with the splitting headache. She wanted to go with you, but I made her go to bed." "Nothing serious, Oh no, she's going to play golf with you in the morning. You can spare her for just one night, can't you, Dexter?" Her smile was kind. She and Dexter liked each other. In the living room, he talked for a moment before he said goodnight. Returning to the University Club where he had rooms, he stood in the doorway for a moment and watched the dancers. He leaned toward the doorpost, nodded at a man or two, yawned. "Hello, darling." The familiar voice at his elbow startled him. Judy Jones had left a man and crossed the room to him. Judy Jones, a slender, enameled doll in a cloth of gold. Gold in a band at her head. Gold in 2 slipper points at her dress's hem. The fragile glow of her face seemed to blossom as she smiled at him. A breeze of warmth and light blew through the room. His hands in his pockets of his dinner jacket tightened spasmodically. He was filled with a sudden excitement. "When did you get back?" he asked casually. "Come here and I'll tell you about it." She turned and he followed her. She had been away. He could have wept at the wonder of her return. She had passed through the enchanted streets, doing things that were like provocative music. All mysterious happenings, all fresh and quickening hopes, had gone away with her, come back now with her. She turned in the doorway. "Have you a car here? If you haven't, I have. I have a coupe." In then, with a rustle of golden cloth, he slammed the door. Into so many cars she had stepped. Like this, like that, her back against leather, so her elbow resting on the door, waiting. She would have been soiled long since there had been anything to soil her except herself. But this was her own self-outpouring. With an effort, he forced himself to start the car and back into the street. This was nothing, he must remember. He had done this before, and he had put her behind him, as he would have crossed a bad account from his books. He drove slowly downtown, affecting abstraction, traversed the deserted streets of the business section, people here and there where a movie was giving out its crowd, or where consumptive or pugilistic youth lounged in front of pool halls. The clink of glasses and the slap of hands on the bars issued from saloons, cloisters of glazed glass and dirty yellow light. She was watching him closely, and the silence was embarrassing. Yet in this crisis he could find no casual word with which to profane the hour. At a convenient turning, he began to zigzag back toward the University Club. "Have you missed me?" she asked suddenly. Everybody missed you. He wondered if she knew Irene Shearer. She had been back only a day. Her absence had been almost contemporaneous with his engagement. "What a remark!" Judy laughed sadly, without sadness. She looked at him searchingly. He became absorbed in the dashboard. "You're handsomer than you used to be," she said thoughtfully. "Dexter, you have the most rememberable eyes." He could have laughed at this, but he did not laugh. It was the sort of thing she said to sophomores. Yet it stabbed him. "I'm awfully tired of everything, darling." She called everyone darling, endowing the endearment with careless and visual camaraderie. "I wish you'd marry me." The directness of this confused him. He should have told her now that he was going to marry another girl, but he could not tell her. He could as easily have sworn that he had never loved her. "I think we get along," she continued on the same note, "unless probably you've forgotten me and fallen in love with another girl." Her confidence was obviously enormous. She had said, in effect, that she found such a thing impossible to believe. That if it were true that he had merely committed a childish indiscretion, and probably to show off, she would have forgiven him, because it was not a matter of a moment, but rather something to be brushed aside lightly. "Of course you could never love anybody but me," she continued. "I like the way you love me. Oh, Dexter, have you forgotten last year?" "No, I haven't forgotten." "Neither have I." Was she sincerely moved, or was she carried along by the wave of her own acting? Question number 10. Why would the reader doubt Judy's sincerity? Is it because Judy was recently overheard gossiping about the way she manipulates Dexter? Is it because Judy is practicing a dramatic play and could easily be practicing her lines? Is it that Judy said she would marry Dexter in the past, then left him behind for someone else? Or is it that Judy is intent on destroying Irene Shearer's reputation? I wish we could be like that again, she said, and he forced himself to answer. I don't think we can. I suppose not. I hear you're giving Irene Shearer a violent rush. There was not the faintest emphasis on her name, yet Dexter was suddenly ashamed. Oh, take me home, cried Judy suddenly. I don't want to go back to that idiotic dance with those children. Then, as he turned up the street that led to the residence district, Judy began to cry quietly to herself. He had never seen her cry before. The dark street lightened. The dwellings of the rich loomed up around them. He stopped his coupe in front of the great white bulk of the Mortimer Joneses' house. Solemn, gorgeous, drenched with the splendor of the damp moonlight. Its solidity startled him. The strong walls, the steel of the girders, the breadth and beam and pomp of it were there only to bring out the contrast to the light beauty inside him, to the young beauty inside him. It was sturdy to accentuate her slightliness, as if to show what a breeze could be generated by a butterfly's wing. He sat perfectly quiet, his nerves in a wild clamor, afraid that if he moved he would find her irresistibly in his arms. 2 tears had rolled down her wet face and trembled on her upper lip. I'm more beautiful than anybody else, she said brokenly. Why can't I be happy? Her moist eyes tore at his stability. Her mouth turned slowly downward with an exquisite sadness. I'd like to marry you if you'll have me, Dexter. I suppose you think I'm not worth having, but I'll be so beautiful for you, Dexter. A million phrases of anger, pride, passion, hatred, tenderness fought on his lips. Then a perfect wave of emotion washed over him, carrying off with it a sediment of wisdom, of convention, of doubt, of honor. This was his girl who was speaking, his own, his beautiful, his pride. Won't you come in? He heard her draw in her breath sharply, waiting. All right, his voice was trembling. I'll come in. It was strange that neither when it was over, nor a long time afterward, did he regret that night. Looking at it from the perspective of 10 years, the fact that Judy's flair for him endured just 1 month seemed of little importance. Nor did it matter that by his yielding he subjected himself to a deeper agony in the end, and gave serious hurt to Irene Shearer and to Irene's parents, who had befriended him. There was nothing sufficiently pictorial about Irene's grief to stamp itself on his mind. So here he is, having spent the night with Judy Jones, who just showed up again, and we know the kind of person she is, and he's set to marry Irene. Yet, he did not regret that night. And even though he knows he hurt Irene and Irene's parents, who had befriended him, been nice to him, there was nothing sufficiently pictorial about Irene's grief to stamp itself on his mind. It really didn't hurt him that Irene was grieving when she found out about this. What does it say about Dexter? Dexter was at bottom hard-minded. The attitude of the city on his actions was of no importance to him, not because he was going to leave the city, but because any outside attitude on the situation seemed superficial. He was completely indifferent to popular opinion, nor, when he had seen that it was no use, that he did not possess himself in the power to move fundamentally, or to hold Judy Jones, did he bear any malice toward her. He loved her, and he would love her until the day he was too old for loving. But he could not have her. So he tasted the deep pain that is reserved only for the strong, just as he had tasted for a little while the deep happiness. Even the ultimate falsity of the grounds upon which Judy terminated the engagement, that she did not want to take him away from Irene, Judy, who had wanted nothing else, did not revolt him. He was beyond any revulsion or any amusement. So, she falsely claimed that she did not want to take him away from Irene, even though clearly by suggesting that he come in that night, she did. It didn't revolt him. That didn't disgust him about Judy, even though she said, my intent is not to take you away from Irene, but won't you come in for the night? Obviously that is her intent. It didn't revolt him. He went east in February with the intention of selling out his laundries and settling in New York. But the war came to America in March and changed his plans. He returned to the West, handed over the management of the business to his partner, and went into the first officers' training camp in late April. He was one of those young thousands who greeted the war with a certain amount of relief, welcoming the liberation of webs of tangled emotion. This story is not his biography, remember, although things creep into it which have nothing to do with those dreams he had when he was young. We are almost done with them, and with him now. There is only one more incident to be related here, and it happens 7 years farther on. So be thinking about this in terms of a timeline, right? So the story begins where we learn that Dexter is a young teen. He's a caddy at this golf club. He meets Judy Jones, doesn't know it's really her. She's 11, whatever. Then there's 7 years where he is a business owner. He owns laundromats in the city where he lives, presumably Minneapolis, because we know this is in Minnesota. So then he moves to New York. At that point, the narrator stops the story and says, but that's not the content of our story. The content of our story actually takes place in the 7 years in which he was a wealthy laundromat business owner in Minnesota, back in the Middle West, is what they refer to it as. And so that's what's happening here. All of this between Judy coming, going, finding new men, being interested in Dexter again, finding a new man, being interested in Dexter again, and then Irene, and then Judy, all takes place sort of during that time frame. At this point, Dexter's 24. He is wealthy, doing well for himself, all of that. But here we are talking about 7 years farther on. So just a quick recap. This story is not his, Dexter Green's, biography. Remember, although things creep into it which have nothing to do with those dreams he had when he was young, we are almost done with them, and with him now. There is only one more incident to be related here, and it happens 7 years farther on. It took place in New York, where he had done well, so well that there were no barriers too high for him. He was 32 years old, and except for one flying trip immediately after the war, he had not been west in 7 years. A man named Devlin from Detroit came into his office to see him in a business way. And there this incident occurred, and closed out, so to speak, this particular side of his life. So you're from the Middle West, said the man Devlin with careless curiosity. That's funny. I thought men like you were probably born and raised on Wall Street. Wife of one of my best friends in Detroit came from your city. I was an usher at the wedding. Dexter waited with no apprehension of what was coming. Judy Sims, said Devlin with no particular interest. Judy Jones she was once. Wait a minute. So we have to back up. Go to this paragraph again. So you're from the Middle West. This Devlin, he comes into Dexter's office. That's funny. I thought men like you were probably born and raised on Wall Street. Then he says, the wife of one of my best friends in Detroit came from your city. I was an usher at the wedding. Her name's Judy Sims, Devlin says, with no particular interest. Judy Jones, she was once. So he knows her in Detroit, but she came from Minneapolis. And Dexter says, yes, I knew her. He had heard, of course, that she was married. Perhaps deliberately, he had heard no more. Awful nice girl, brooded Devlin meaninglessly. I'm sort of sorry for her. And Dexter, of course, having not seen her for 7 years, says, why? He was alert, receptive all at once. Oh, Lud Sims has gone to pieces in a way. I don't mean he ill-uses her, but he drinks and runs around. She doesn't run around? Again, the dramatic irony here is that we know that that's the kind of person that she was. No, stays at home with her kids. Oh. She's a little too old for him. What? Time, it seems, has shaded Dexter's view of her. Too old? Why, man, she's only 27. He possessed with a wild notion of rushing out into the streets and taking a train to Detroit. He rose to his feet spasmodically. I guess you're busy, Devlin apologized quickly. I didn't realize. No, I'm not too busy, said Dexter, steadying his voice. I'm not too busy at all. Not busy at all. Did you say she was 27? No, I said she was 27. Yes, you did, agreed Devlin dryly. Go on, then. Go on. What do you mean? About Judy Jones. Devlin looked at him helplessly, like, why do you care? What do you care about Judy Jones? You know, she's just some housewife who stays at home with her kids, and she's old. Well, that's not the Judy Jones that Dexter knew. The dream of Judy Jones is becoming old. It's becoming less desirable. Well, I told you all there is to it. He treats her like the devil. Oh, they're not going to get divorced or anything. When he's particularly outrageous, she forgives him. In fact, I'm inclined to think she loves him. She was a pretty girl when she first came to Detroit. A pretty girl? The phrase struck Dexter as ludicrous. Isn't she a pretty girl anymore? Oh, she's all right. Look here, said Dexter, sitting down suddenly. I don't understand. You say she was a pretty girl, and now you say she's all right. I don't understand what you mean. Judy Jones wasn't a pretty girl at all. She was a great beauty. Why, I knew her. She was... Devlin laughed pleasantly. I'm not trying to start a row, he said. I think Judy's a nice girl, and I like her. I can't understand how a man like Lud Sims could fall madly in love with her, but he did. Then he added, most of the women like her. Dexter looked closely at Devlin, thinking wildly that there must be a reason for this, some insensitivity in the man, or some private malice. Lots of women just fade like that. Devlin snapped his fingers. You must have seen it happen. Perhaps I've forgotten how pretty she was at her wedding. I've seen her so much since then, you know. She has nice eyes. A sort of dullness settled down upon Dexter. For the first time in his life, he felt like getting very drunk. He knew that he was laughing out loud at something Devlin had said, but he did not know what it was or why it was funny. When, in a few minutes, Devlin went to lay down on his lounge and looked out the window at the New York skyline, into which the sun was sinking in dull, lovely shades of pink and gold. He had thought that having nothing else to lose when he was vulnerable at last, but he knew that he had just lost something more. As surely as if he married Judy Jones and seen her fade away right before his eyes. The dream was gone. Something had been taken from him. In a sort of panic, he pushed the palms of his hands into his eyes and tried to bring up a picture of the waters lapping on Cherry Island in the moonlit veranda, and gingham on the golf links, and the dry sun and the gold color of her neck's soft down, and her mouth damp to his kisses, and her eyes plaintive with melancholy, and her freshness like new fine linen in the morning. Why, these things were no longer in the world. They had existed, and they existed no longer.
He talked a lot about the past, as if he wanted to recover something.
If I could just get back to the star. I could just get back to the star. I could find it again.
Some vision of himself that he had put into loving Daisy.
I knew it was a great mistake for a man like me to fall in love. I'm only 32. I might still be a great man if I could forget that I once lost Daisy, but my life, old sport, my life has got to be like this. It's got to keep going on.
For the first time in years, the tears were streaming down his face. But they were for himself now. He did not care about the mouth and eyes and moving hands. He wanted to care, and he could not care, for he had gone away and could never go back anymore. The gates were closed, the sun was going down, and there was no beauty in the gray beauty of steel that withstands all time. Even the grief he could have borne was left behind in the country of illusion, of youth. So your question 11 says, how does Dexter's disappointment reflect Fitzgerald's view of the American dream? Of the richness of life where his winter dreams had flourished. Long ago, he said. Long ago there was something in me, but now that thing is gone. Now that thing is gone. That thing is gone. I cannot cry. I cannot care. That thing will come back no more. If you remember at the beginning of the story, we explained what winter dreams are. Dexter's winter dreams are essentially his vision of the American dream, in that you can always strive for more than your lot in life. This is why he leaves his caddy job. This is why he wanted the glittering things, not necessarily just association with the glittering things. Why he went to New York, and why every time he sees Judy, he goes back to her, because his dreams of what she represents are something that he can never attain, because she never returns that favor to him. She always sort of brushes him aside and then comes back to him. And so when he learns here at the end of the story that she has definitely fallen short of who he expects her to be, it sort of represents the winter dreams themselves. They are not attainable. Maybe we're just given the life we have, and that's the life we have to have. If we strive for more, it'll never be attained. This is evidenced by what Judy became. Fitzgerald does not have a high opinion of the American dream. You can see how that is represented in different aspects of this story. We are what we're born to be, and that's that. Aspiring for more is not a realistic option according to him. And you can see how, through the different biological videos, how Dexter sort of represents his life. He never quite became what he aspired to be, even though he did have a lot of success. But the interview early in the story, I think is very telling. The interviewer says that Dexter understood that the end result is not the dream. The dream is the process. Those pieces are there for a moment, Judy, for example. And then they're important, but they are a moment. The end result is not the answer. It's the process that's important. So here we are at a learning scale. The first scale that I'm going to talk about with you as we wrap up here is the inferencing scale. Remember, an inference is when we take what we know, what the text says explicitly, and we're able to make logical leaps based on that. If we can make that logical leap, then we know we can draw those conclusions. Then we know that we've made an inference because we're making those leaps based on things that we know. So take a look at the learning scale and decide where you think you land. Now, as we look at this learning scale, considering things that we may have known from the story, let's go back to when Dexter quit his caddy job. It says the woman who had done this was Judy Jones, right? The text is on the screen now, and what that was, if that sort of caused something in your mind to go, wait a minute, why would he do that just because some girl threw a fit because she needed a caddy and yelled at her nurse? If that struck something in you, then you can definitely put yourself at a 3. That not necessarily that you knew that it's because he was always striving for something more. He thought, my lot in life is not where I need to be. I can always find something more. If you didn't make that connection, that's okay. You were able to, at least it triggered something that said, wait a minute, that seems odd. That's worth noting. What's that about? Well, as we've since learned, that is a building block for other things that have happened in his life, even though, as we saw, that sort of let him down as his life went on with the way he handled his relationship with Judy Jones. The second learning goal is chooses to structure the text for either maybe a comedic moment or a tragic solution. Our narrator tells us that the story begins when Dexter is 14, and then we kind of get a layout of most of Dexter's life, right? At least up to the point where the story is being told. He's 14, he's a caddy, he leaves being a caddy, becomes a successful businessman in owning laundromats, owns I think 7 of them, and then the story moves up and says, well, then he moved to New York. And then at one point we see the story takes place 7 years earlier. So it's like a flashback back to those 7 years where he was in St. Paul and was running those laundromats. And there he was wealthy, he was successful, he had more than just association with the glittering things. He had the glittering things themselves. And so the story takes place, his interactions with Judy and Irene sort of take place at that point. But the tragic resolution, interestingly enough, happens right at the end of the story. The narrator essentially says, flash forward, now we're in New York, right? When Devlin walks in and says, oh, I know someone from back in your town. Her name's Judy Sims. She's married. And then the tragic resolution is that she is not at all what Dexter expected her to be, right? But by that flashback and kind of setting up the relationship in the history that they had together, we're able to set up this 7 years later, where 7 years and you haven't heard from someone, that's a long time. You can definitely lose touch with someone over the course of 7 years, especially when you move halfway across the country. And so setting up that distance in both location and their relationship, the distance between them, the fact that they hadn't talked in a long time and whatever, he was sort of more heartbroken than he would have been had he maybe watched her go through that marriage and change who she was. Instead, it was just like, it happened. He didn't know it was happening, but he got word and he was more heartbroken. Again, not over her, but over the dream of what she represented for him for so many years. So if you're able to identify how that movement in the timeline of the story created that tragic resolution, then you can put yourself at a 3 or a 4. But if you kind of missed how we skipped around in the story, it wasn't a linear story. It was, we start here, then we skip ahead. No, actually, we're going to talk about this middle portion, and then we'll finish back again at the end. So how a story is put together by an author can definitely create a mood and a tone in the story. And that's kind of one of the things we were analyzing with Winter Dreams. So once you have answered these questions, you have earned your 5 units for this assignment. Hope you enjoyed it. Hi everyone. One last opportunity to earn a few extra units. At the Write in Ed puzzle right now is an assignment sheet for a essay portion tied to Winter Dreams. It is about whether or not this is a story about greed or denial. Do you think that Dexter was greedy and he got what he deserved at the end? Or the whole story is him being denied what he so deserved the whole time? The assignment sheet, like I said, is posted. It is worth 3 extra units on top of the 5 that you earned for completing this assignment. So that makes a total of 8. So that's just an extra opportunity for you there. Hope you take that up. Have a great day.